The words hit me like a physical blow across the dinner table. Your sister's family comes first. You're always last meridian. Dad's voice was cold, matter-of-fact, as if he was discussing the weather. 28 years of being the forgotten daughter crystallized into this single moment. But what happened next would shatter everything I thought I knew about my family. The truth I discovered that night would expose decades of lies, betrayal, and a conspiracy that went deeper than favoritism. It would destroy them all. Hey everyone. Before we dive into this family drama that will absolutely blow your mind, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if stories about family justice and karma speak to your soul, like they do mine, smash that like button and subscribe because this tale of revenge is going to take some seriously unexpected turns. Trust me, you'll want to see how this family's web of lies completely unravels. That dinner was supposed to celebrate my promotion to senior marketing director at a prestigious consulting firm. Instead, it became the night everything fell apart. My sister Delphine sat there smugly, her husband Marcus nodding along, as Dad explained why their upcoming European vacation needed funding, while my student loans could wait another year. Meridian makes good money now, Dad continued, cutting his steak with deliberate precision. She can handle her own expenses. Delphine has 3 children to think about. Mom stayed silent, as always, her eyes fixed on her plate like it held the secrets of the universe. This was our family dynamic, Delphine. The golden child, me, the afterthought, and Mom, the enabler, who never spoke up. I've been asking for help with those loans for 5 years, I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. The interest is killing me. And you'll figure it out, Dad replied dismissively. You always do. You're the strong one. Remember, Delphine needs our support. The strong one. Code for the one who gets nothing but is expected to give everything. I had paid for my own college while they funded Delphine's art degree at an expensive private school. I had bought my own car while they surprised her with a BMW for her birthday. I had moved out at 18 while they renovated the basement into a luxury apartment for her family when Marcus lost his job. What about when I needed help after the accident? I asked. My hands trembling slightly as I remembered the months of physical therapy, the medical bills that nearly bankrupted me. Where was the family support then? You managed fine, Dad said with a shrug. Besides, that was different. Delphine's situation is ongoing. Ongoing. Their problems were always ongoing, always more important, always taking priority over anything happening in my life. When I graduated summa cum laude, they missed my ceremony for one of Delphine's kids' soccer games. When I got my first major promotion, they were too busy helping her move to a bigger house to celebrate with me. I'm done, I said, standing up abruptly. The words came out stronger than I felt. I'm done being the family doormat. Meridian, sit down. Mom finally spoke, her voice sharp with warning. Don't cause a scene. A scene? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. 28 years of being invisible, and you're worried about a scene? That's when Delphine made her fatal mistake. She leaned back in her chair with that entitled smirk I knew so well and said, maybe if you had made better life choices, you wouldn't need help. Some of us planned ahead. Something snapped inside me. The careful diplomatic mask I had worn for decades cracked and fell away. Better life choices, like dropping out of college to become a professional victim, like marrying a man who hasn't held a steady job in 7 years, like having 3 kids you can't afford, and then expecting everyone else to pay for them. How dare you? Delphine shot up her face, flushed with indignation. At least I have a family. At least I'm not some bitter, lonely workaholic who... At least I'm not a fraud. I interrupted the words tumbling out before I could stop them. The room went dead silent. Dad's fork clattered against his plate. Mom's face went white as paper. But it was the look that passed between Delphine and Marcus that told me everything I needed to know. Fear. Panic. Guilt. What did you just say? Dad's voice was dangerously low. I should have backed down. The old Meridian would have apologized and slunk away. But something had shifted in that moment of confrontation. 28 years of suppressed rage and resentment had found their voice. I said what I said, I replied, meeting his glare head-on. Maybe it's time this family faced some hard truths. You need to leave, Mom said quietly, her hands shaking as she reached for her water glass. I think you should go home and cool off. Oh, I'm leaving, I assured her, grabbing my purse from the back of my chair. But this conversation isn't over. Not by a long shot. As I walked toward the door, I heard Delphine whisper urgently to Marcus. She doesn't know anything. She can't know anything. But I did know something. I had known for months, ever since I accidentally discovered the truth about their perfect little family setup. The late nights at the office had paid off in ways they never imagined. My position gave me access to financial databases, background checks, and public records that painted a very different picture of Delphine's life than the one she presented to our parents. The fraud comment hadn't been random anger. It had been a warning shot, and from the terror in their eyes, they had received the message loud and clear. Walking to my car, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: power. For the first time in my adult life, I held cards they didn't even know I had. The golden child was about to discover that even favorites can fall from grace when their pedestals are built on lies. The question was no longer whether I would expose them. The question was how much damage I wanted to inflict when I brought their whole world crashing down. The drive home gave me time to think clearly for the first time in hours. My hands had stopped shaking, replaced by a cold, calculating calm that surprised me. 3 months ago, I had stumbled across information that changed everything I thought I knew about my sister's picture-perfect life. Tonight's dinner had simply been the catalyst I needed to act on it. It started innocently enough. My consulting firm had been hired to investigate potential insurance fraud for a major healthcare provider. Part of my job involved cross-referencing disability claims with social media activity and public records. I had gotten good at spotting inconsistencies patterns that didn't quite add up. That's when I saw Marcus's name in the database. My brother-in-law had been collecting disability benefits for a supposed back injury that prevented him from working. According to his claim, he could barely lift 10 pounds without excruciating pain. Yet there he was in Delphine's Instagram photos from last month, helping friends move furniture into their new apartment. The timestamp showed it was taken the same day he filed a claim update describing his worsening condition. But that was just the beginning. The deeper I dug, the more elaborate their scheme became. Marcus had been working under-the-table construction jobs for nearly 2 years while collecting full disability payments. Delphine had been reporting false income on their housing assistance applications, claiming Marcus made no money while secretly funneling his cash payments through multiple accounts. The family that constantly needed financial help from my parents was actually bringing in more money than I made at my legitimate job. They had turned poverty into performance art, complete with carefully curated social media posts designed to generate sympathy and financial support from extended family and friends. My parents weren't their only victims. I discovered GoFundMe campaigns for medical expenses that were already covered by insurance charity applications claiming financial hardship, while luxury purchases appeared on Delphine's social media, and even a scholarship fund they had established in their children's names that somehow never seemed to actually benefit any children. They were professional victims, and they were good at it. Sitting in my apartment that night, I spread everything across my dining table like pieces of a puzzle. Bank statements I had obtained through perfectly legal channels, social media screenshots with metadata, public records showing property purchases and business licenses, insurance documents, tax filings that told a completely different story than their sob stories. The evidence was overwhelming, but it was also dangerous. What I had discovered wasn't just morally reprehensible, it was criminal. Federal charges state fraud tax evasion. We were talking about potentially decades in prison if the right prosecutor got hold of this information. Which brought me to my dilemma. As much as I wanted revenge for 28 years of being treated like garbage, did I really want to destroy my sister's children's lives? They were innocent in all this, victims of their parents' greed and selfishness, just like I had been a victim of family favoritism. But then I remembered dinner. Dad's cold dismissal. Delphine's smug superiority. The way they all acted like my feelings, my needs, my very existence was an inconvenience to be managed rather than respected. I thought about all the family gatherings where their problems took center stage while my achievements went unnoticed. Birthday parties where their gift lists were fulfilled while mine was forgotten. Holiday celebrations where their needs determined every plan while my preferences never even entered the conversation. They had made their choice about family loyalty a long time ago. Now it was time for me to make mine. I picked up my laptop and began typing. Not a confrontational email or an angry social media post, something much more strategic. A comprehensive report documenting everything I had discovered, complete with supporting evidence and legal analysis. I had learned to be thorough in my professional life, and that attention to detail was about to serve me very well. But I wasn't going to rush this. Revenge served cold hits harder than anything delivered in the heat of anger. I needed to be smart about timing, about approach, about maximizing the impact while protecting myself from potential backlash. The first step was creating leverage. I scheduled meetings with a lawyer specializing in fraud cases and a private investigator who could help me fill in any gaps in my evidence. I also reached out to a journalist friend who worked the financial crime beat for a major newspaper. Information was power, but presentation was everything. The second step was building allies. I had always been the family outsider, but that meant I also had perspective the others lacked. I started reaching out to extended family members, cousins, and aunts, who had always seemed uncomfortable with the obvious favoritism, but never spoke up about it. Casual conversations about fairness and family dynamics. Planting seeds that would bloom when the truth finally came to light. The third step was documentation. Every future interaction with my family would be recorded, photographed, or witnessed. I installed security cameras at my apartment, started backing up all our text messages and emails to cloud storage, and began keeping detailed journals of every conversation and encounter. If they wanted to play games with family loyalty, I was going to make sure I won. My phone buzzed with a text from Delphine. "Dad's really upset about tonight. Maybe you should apologize before this gets out of hand." I stared at the message for a long time before responding. Some things can't be taken back once they're said. I think we both know what I'm talking about. Her response came immediately. "I have no idea what you mean." But the timestamp told a different story. She had started typing a response 4 different times before settling on that lie. My forensic training had taught me to notice details like that. Guilty people always hesitated before committing to their deception. "Sure you don't," I typed back. "Sweet dreams, sister." I turned off my phone and poured myself a glass of wine. For the first time in years, I felt like I was in control of my own story. Tomorrow, I would start putting my plan into action. But tonight, I was going to savor this feeling of finally having the upper hand. The golden child was about to learn that even the most carefully constructed lies eventually crumble under the weight of truth. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of careful preparation and strategic maneuvering. I had learned patience during my years of being overlooked, and now that virtue was serving me well. Every move had to be calculated, every piece positioned perfectly before I could bring down their house of cards. My lawyer, Patricia Hendricks, was a shark in designer suits who specialized in white-collar crime. She reviewed my evidence with the methodical precision of a surgeon occasionally nodding or making notes in her legal pad. When she finally looked up, her expression was grave. "This is extensive," she said, tapping the stack of documents I had provided. "We're talking about multiple federal crimes here. Mail fraud, wire fraud, tax evasion, disability fraud, housing assistance fraud. If prosecuted to the full extent, your sister and brother-in-law could be looking at 15 to 20 years in federal prison." "And their children?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Would likely enter the foster care system unless other family members step up to take them." Patricia leaned back in her chair, studying my face. "Meridian, I have to ask, are you absolutely certain you want to pursue this? Once we set this in motion, there's no taking it back." I thought about Dad's words at dinner. "Your sister's family comes first. You're always last." "I'm certain," I replied without hesitation. "Then we need to be strategic about how we proceed. I recommend we start with the insurance company and the IRS. Let them conduct their investigations first. That way, when law enforcement gets involved, the case is already built for them." The private investigator, James Morrison, filled in the remaining gaps in my evidence. Within a week, he had uncovered even more damning information. Marcus had been operating under 3 different identities for various under-the-table jobs. Delphine had been using her children's social security numbers to open credit accounts. They had even been collecting rental income from a property they claimed to have lost in bankruptcy proceedings. But the most shocking discovery came when James followed them for several days. The family that constantly pleaded poverty had been living a double life of remarkable luxury. Designer clothes hidden in the back of their closets. A boat registered under a friend's name that they used every weekend. Regular meals at expensive restaurants always paid for in cash to avoid paper trails. They weren't just committing fraud. They were living like millionaires while crying poor to everyone who knew them. Armed with this information, I began reaching out to family members I had neglected for years. My cousin Rebecca, who had always rolled her eyes at family gatherings when Delphine dominated every conversation with her latest crisis. My Uncle Thomas, who had quietly mentioned to me years ago that something didn't add up about Marcus's disability claims. My Aunt Sarah, who had always seemed uncomfortable with how differently my parents treated Delphine and me. I didn't dump everything on them at once. Instead, I asked careful questions, shared subtle observations, and let them draw their own conclusions. The response was more overwhelming than I had expected. "I've been waiting for someone to say what we were all thinking," Rebecca confided during a coffee meeting. "The whole family has been walking on eggshells around them for years. Every gathering becomes a fundraising event for their latest emergency." Thomas was more direct. "I've been in construction for 30 years. Marcus's supposed injuries wouldn't prevent him from doing desk work or light supervision. The whole disability claim never made sense to me." But it was Sarah who provided the most valuable insight. "Your parents know something's not right. I've seen the doubt in your mother's eyes when Delphine tells her stories. But they're so invested in the narrative of her being the victim that they can't admit they've been enablers." This revelation changed my strategy completely. My parents weren't just innocent victims of Delphine's manipulation. They were willful participants who had chosen to believe convenient lies rather than face uncomfortable truths. That made their treatment of me even more unforgivable. The turning point came when Delphine made her next move. She called me 3 days after our confrontational dinner, her voice sweet with false concern. "Meridian, I've been thinking about what happened the other night. I know we both said things we didn't mean. Maybe we should talk clear the air before this misunderstanding gets blown out of proportion." "What misunderstanding would that be?" I asked innocently. You seem to suggest that Marcus and I were somehow being dishonest about our situation. I know you're stressed about your loans, and sometimes stress can make us say things we don't really believe. The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that I almost admired the technique. Almost. I said what I meant, I replied calmly. No stress involved. There was a long pause before she tried a different approach. Look, I know Dad can seem harsh sometimes, but he doesn't mean it the way it sounds. We're all family here. We look out for each other. Some of us do, I agreed. Others take advantage of family loyalty for personal gain. What exactly are you implying? The question hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken threats and desperate fear. This was the moment I had been building toward the perfect opportunity to let her know exactly how much trouble she was in. I'm not implying anything, Delphine. I'm stating facts. Facts that are very well documented. Facts that certain federal agencies might find very interesting. The silence that followed was deafening. I could almost hear the wheels turning in her head as she processed what I had just said. When she spoke again, her voice was small and scared. You don't understand the situation. It's complicated. There are things you don't know about our circumstances. I know more than you think I do. Much more. Meridian, please. We need to meet, face to face. There are things I need to explain. I'm sure there are, but explanations aren't going to make federal crimes disappear. Federal crimes? Her voice cracked. You're being ridiculous. This is family business, not some criminal conspiracy. Insurance fraud is federal business. Tax evasion is federal business. Wire fraud is federal business. Shall I continue? She started crying. Then the kind of manipulative tears she had perfected over decades of getting her way through emotional manipulation. But I had immunity to her tears now built up through years of watching her perform for sympathetic audiences. Please, she whispered. The children. Think about the children. I am thinking about them. I'm thinking about how they deserve better than parents who built their lives on lies and theft. I'm thinking about how they deserve to grow up understanding that actions have consequences. You can't do this. Your family. Family. I let the word hang in the air for a moment. You know, Delphine, I used to think family meant unconditional love and support. Then I spent 28 years learning that family means whatever's convenient for the people with power. Well, guess what? The power dynamic just shifted. I hung up before she could respond, and immediately called Patricia to let her know that our timeline had just accelerated. Delphine would be calling Marcus, then probably my parents. They would try to circle the wagons, come up with strategies to protect themselves, and discredit me. But they were about to discover that the meek little sister they had dismissed for decades had learned a thing or two about strategy herself. And their strategies were built on the assumption that I was still the same powerless victim they had always known. They were wrong. Dead wrong. The countdown to their reckoning had officially begun. The dominoes started falling faster than I had anticipated. Within 48 hours of my phone call with Delphine, my entire family was in crisis mode. Mom called first, her voice shaking with a combination of anger and desperation I had never heard before. Meridian, what have you done? She demanded without preamble. Delphine is hysterical. She says you're threatening to destroy her family over some petty jealousy. Petty jealousy. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Mom, your golden child has been committing federal crimes for years while you funded her lifestyle. This isn't about jealousy. This is about justice. I don't know what lies you think you've uncovered, but they're not lies. I interrupted her, my voice cold and steady. I have bank records, social media evidence, insurance documents, tax filings, and witness statements. Marcus has been collecting disability while working construction jobs. Delphine has been hiding income from housing assistance programs. They've been running charity scams and false GoFundMe campaigns. This isn't family drama, Mom. This is organized fraud. The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. She had suspected. Deep down, she had known something was wrong, but had chosen willful ignorance over uncomfortable truth. Even if that were true, she said finally, you're talking about destroying your own family. Those children would lose everything. Those children are losing everything anyway, I replied. The difference is whether they lose it now, when they're young enough to recover, or later when the house of cards collapses and takes everyone down with it. Dad called 2 hours later. No emotional appeals, no attempts at manipulation. Just cold, hard intimidation tactics that might have worked on the scared little girl I used to be. You will stop this nonsense immediately, he commanded in the voice that used to make me crumble. Whatever game you think you're playing ends now. It's not a game, Dad, and it's not stopping. Do you have any idea what this will do to the family name, to my business reputation? I've spent 40 years building my standing in this community. You should have thought about that before enabling federal criminals, I replied calmly. But don't worry, I'm sure the community will understand that you were just another victim of their deception. You spiteful little... Choose your next words very carefully, I warned him. Everything we say from this point forward is being recorded. I wouldn't want you to say something that could be construed as witness intimidation or obstruction of justice. The line went dead. By the end of the week, the investigations were officially underway. The insurance company had launched a formal fraud investigation after I provided them with my evidence package. The IRS had opened an audit that would likely expand into criminal charges. The State Housing Authority had begun reviewing all of Delphine and Marcus's assistance applications. But the real shock came when James Morrison called me with an update that changed everything. Meridian, you need to hear this, he said, his voice tense with excitement. I've been monitoring their communications since you gave me permission to investigate family members who might be involved. Your parents aren't just enablers, they're active participants. My blood went cold. What do you mean? Your father has been helping them launder money through his business accounts. Your mother has been providing false character references for their benefit applications. They've all been working together to hide assets and manipulate the system. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. My parents weren't innocent victims who had been fooled by their beloved daughter. They were co-conspirators who had actively participated in the fraud while treating me like an inconvenient outsider to their criminal enterprise. How long? I whispered. Based on what I can document, at least 5 years. Probably longer. 5 years. 5 years of family dinners where they discussed their schemes, while I sat there obliviously still hoping for acceptance and inclusion. 5 years of being told I was selfish for wanting help with my student loans, while they were collectively stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars from government programs and insurance companies. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place when I realized why they had always kept me at arm's length. It wasn't just favoritism or personality differences. They had been protecting their criminal operation by excluding the one family member with the professional skills to expose them. My training in financial analysis, my access to databases, my knowledge of fraud detection techniques, they had been terrified of me discovering their schemes. The emotional abuse, the constant dismissal, the systematic exclusion from family decisions, it had all been calculated to keep me from looking too closely at their finances. I was dangerous to them, so they had spent years making me feel powerless. That realization transformed my remaining guilt into pure, focused rage. They hadn't just stolen from strangers or government programs. They had stolen my childhood, my self-worth, and my sense of family belonging to protect their criminal lifestyle. The confrontation came when they requested a family meeting to discuss our situation like adults. We met at a neutral restaurant, all 4 of us sitting around a table like we were negotiating a business deal rather than addressing years of betrayal and crime. Delphine looked haggard. her usual perfect appearance replaced by dark circles and nervous energy. Marcus sat silent and pale, occasionally shooting worried glances at the exits. Mom kept fidgeting with her napkin, unable to meet my eyes. Dad maintained his authoritative facade, but I could see the desperation underneath. "We can work this out," Dad began without preamble. "Family problems should be handled within the family." "Family problems, yes," I agreed. "Federal crimes, no." "What do you want?" Delphine asked bluntly. "Money. We can pay you back. We can make arrangements." "With what money?" I asked. "The disability payments Marcus isn't supposed to be getting, the housing assistance you're not eligible for, the insurance settlements for false claims. We can get legitimate jobs." Marcus spoke for the first time, his voice barely above a whisper. "We can pay restitution." "You can try," I acknowledged. "But that doesn't undo years of federal crimes. That doesn't repair the damage you've done to programs that help people who actually need assistance." "Please," Mom said quietly. "What can we do to fix this?" I looked around the table at the family that had shaped my entire life, and I felt nothing but contempt for their weakness and selfishness. "You can face the consequences of your choices," I said simply. "The same way you always expected me to face mine." I stood up to leave, but Dad grabbed my arm with enough force to leave marks. "If you destroy this family," he hissed, "you'll have nothing left. No one. You'll be alone for the rest of your life." I looked down at his hand on my arm, then back at his face with a smile that made him release his grip immediately. "Dad," I said sweetly, "I've been alone my entire life. The difference is now I chose it." The empire they had built on lies and theft was crumbling, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The arrests came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 3 weeks after our final family meeting. I was drinking coffee and reviewing quarterly reports when Patricia called to let me know that federal agents were executing search warrants at both my parents' house and Delphine's apartment. "It's happening," she said simply. "Are you ready for this?" I thought about that question as I watched the news coverage later that day. Local reporters stood outside my childhood home while investigators carried boxes of evidence to waiting vehicles. The headline scrolling across the bottom of the screen read, "Local family charged in multi-year fraud scheme totaling over $600,000. $600,000. The number was staggering, but what shocked me more was seeing my father in handcuffs on live television. The man who had commanded respect in every room he entered, who had built a reputation as a pillar of the community, was being led to a police car, while neighbors gathered to watch his public humiliation. Mom's arrest footage was harder to watch. She looked smaller, somehow fragile and confused, as if she couldn't quite understand how her carefully constructed world had collapsed so completely. For a moment, I felt something that might have been sympathy. Then I remembered 5 years of family dinners where she had sat silent while I was dismissed and excluded from their criminal conspiracy. Delphine's arrest was captured by a different news crew. Unlike our parents, she had clearly been expecting this moment. Her lawyer was already present, and she maintained her composure as she was processed. But when the reporter shouted questions about her children, I saw the mask slip for just a moment. The reality of what she had done to her own kids was finally hitting home. Marcus had apparently tried to run. Border Patrol caught him at a checkpoint near Mexico, where he was found with $50,000 in cash and fake identification documents. His arrest added federal flight charges to an already overwhelming list of crimes. The children were placed with Sarah and her husband, while the court proceedings began. I had quietly arranged for this placement weeks earlier, working with child services to ensure the kids would go to family members who could provide stability during the chaos. Sarah was grateful for the heads up and had immediately agreed to take them in. The media coverage was relentless. My family's fraud scheme had apparently been larger and more sophisticated than even I had realized. The investigation revealed connections to other criminal networks, false identities dating back over a decade, and offshore accounts that investigators were still trying to trace. But it was the community reaction that truly drove home the scope of their betrayal. Dozens of people came forward with stories of being manipulated by my family's false charity appeals, churches that had taken up collections for their struggling family, neighbors who had donated money for medical expenses that were already covered by insurance, extended family members who had been guilt-tripped into providing financial assistance for emergencies that were fabricated entirely. My phone rang constantly with calls from reporters wanting quotes from the family member who had exposed the scheme. I declined every interview, but I did provide a written statement through Patricia that said simply, "Justice requires accountability even when it's painful, especially when it's family." The legal proceedings moved faster than I had expected. Faced with overwhelming evidence, everyone except Dad agreed to plea deals in exchange for reduced sentences. Dad insisted on going to trial, apparently believing he could charm a jury the same way he had manipulated everyone else for decades. He was wrong. The trial lasted 6 weeks, and I attended every day. I watched prosecutors systematically dismantle the image he had spent 40 years building, exposing him as the architect of a criminal enterprise that had stolen from the most vulnerable members of society. The evidence was presented methodically, building a case so airtight that even Dad's expensive attorneys couldn't find meaningful holes to exploit. When he finally took the stand in his own defense, I saw him clearly for perhaps the first time in my life. Without the family dynamics that had always favored him, without the community reputation that had protected him, he was just a small, selfish man who had chosen crime over integrity and favoritism over fairness. His testimony was a disaster. Under cross-examination, he tried to blame everyone except himself. It was Delphine's idea. Marcus had pressured him. Mom had insisted they help. The prosecutors tore apart every excuse with cold precision, forcing him to acknowledge his central role in planning and executing the fraud. The most damaging moment came when they played audio recordings of family conversations that James had obtained legally through court-approved surveillance. Dad's voice filled the courtroom as he discussed strategies for hiding assets and manipulating investigators. In one particularly damning exchange, he laughed about government programs being easy money from stupid bureaucrats. When the guilty verdict was read, I felt no triumph or satisfaction, just a profound sense of closure that had been decades in the making. The man who had spent my entire life making me feel worthless and unwanted had finally faced consequences for his actions. The sentences were harsh, but fair. Dad received 12 years in federal prison. Mom got 8 years with the possibility of parole after 5. Delphine was sentenced to 10 years, but would likely serve 7 with good behavior. Marcus received the heaviest sentence at 15 years due to his attempted flight and the additional charges that carried. The financial restitution orders were equally severe. Every asset they owned was seized and liquidated. The house I had grown up in was sold at auction. Dad's business was dissolved, its assets distributed among their victims. Even Mom's jewelry collection was confiscated and sold to pay back the money they had stolen. Within 6 months, the family that had controlled my entire emotional landscape for 28 years had been completely destroyed. Their criminal empire was dismantled, their freedom was forfeit, and their victims had been compensated as much as possible. But the most profound change was in my own life. For the first time since childhood, I was free from the weight of their judgment and rejection. I no longer spent emotional energy hoping for acceptance from people who had never deserved my respect. I no longer questioned my worth based on their treatment of me. The family that had made me feel like an outsider was gone. What remained was the opportunity to build something better from the ashes of their destruction. As I walked out of the courthouse after Dad's sentencing, Rebecca caught up with me on the steps. "How do you feel?" she asked gently. I considered the question seriously before answering. "Free," I said finally. "For the first time in my adult life, I feel completely free." And I was. 2 years later, I barely recognized the woman I used to be. The Meridian, who had sat at that dinner table accepting crumbs of affection from people who didn't deserve her love, was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own worth and refused to accept anything less than respect. The healing hadn't happened overnight. Therapy with Dr. Carmen Rodriguez had been essential in helping me understand the depth of psychological damage that decades of emotional abuse had inflicted. I learned terms like scapegoating and golden child syndrome that suddenly made my childhood make sense. I discovered that my family's treatment of me hadn't been normal sibling rivalry or harmless favoritism. It had been systematic psychological abuse designed to maintain their power structure. But more importantly, I learned that none of it had ever been about my worth as a person. Their need to diminish me had always been about their own insecurities and criminal enterprise, not about any actual shortcomings on my part. My career flourished once I stopped carrying the emotional burden of their constant criticism and doubt. Within 18 months of their arrests, I had been promoted to vice president of my consulting firm. My expertise in financial fraud detection had become invaluable to corporate clients who wanted to avoid the kind of devastating scandals my family had created. The irony wasn't lost on me that their crimes had inadvertently enhanced my professional reputation. I was now recognized as an expert who could spot fraud that others missed, someone who understood both the technical and psychological aspects of financial deception. But the most meaningful changes were personal. Without the toxic family dynamics that had dominated my life, I finally had space to build genuine relationships based on mutual respect and affection. Sarah had become the mother figure I had never really had. Our weekly coffee meetings evolved into a friendship that filled the maternal void my biological mother had left empty. When I bought my new house, Sarah was the first person I called to share the news. When I got food poisoning and needed someone to bring me soup, she showed up without being asked. Rebecca and I grew closer as well, bonding over shared experiences of family dysfunction and the relief of finally being free from it. She introduced me to her book club, which led to friendships with women who knew nothing about my family history and liked me simply for who I was. These relationships taught me what healthy dynamics actually looked like. The children were thriving with Sarah and her husband. I had established college funds for all 3 of them, funded partly by my increased salary and partly by victim compensation money that I had chosen to redirect toward their futures. They would not be defined by their parents' crimes the way I had been defined by my family's treatment. I visited them regularly, becoming the aunt I wished I had been allowed to be before their parents' arrest. Without Delphine and Marcus controlling the narrative and limiting my access, I discovered that I actually enjoyed spending time with kids. They were smart, funny, and resilient in ways that gave me hope for their futures. The youngest, Emma, had started calling me Auntie Mary and asking when I was coming to her school events. The middle child, David, shared my love of puzzles and strategy games. The oldest, Sophia, had begun confiding in me about typical teenage problems, seeking advice from someone she trusted to tell her the truth rather than what she wanted to hear. I had become part of a chosen family built on love and respect rather than obligation and manipulation. These relationships weren't perfect, but they were honest. When conflicts arose, we talked through them like adults rather than resorting to emotional manipulation and power games. The letters from prison had stopped coming after the first year. Initially, all 4 of them had written regularly, alternating between apologetic manipulation and angry blame. Dad's letters had been particularly predictable, following a pattern of rage, bargaining, false remorse, and then rage again when I didn't respond. Mom's letters had been the hardest to ignore because they focused on how much she missed me and how sorry she was for not protecting me from the family dynamics. But Dr. Rodriguez had helped me understand that missing someone and loving them are different things, and that regret about consequences isn't the same as genuine remorse about choices. When I stopped responding to any of their communications, the letters gradually stopped coming. They had finally learned that I wasn't the same powerless person they had controlled for decades. The media attention had died down, but occasionally reporters still reached out for follow-up stories about family fraud or white-collar crime. I had started accepting some interviews, using them as opportunities to raise awareness about financial abuse and the warning signs of family manipulation. My story had apparently resonated with people who recognized similar dynamics in their own families. I received emails from strangers sharing their experiences with golden child favoritism, financial manipulation, and the courage it takes to choose justice over family loyalty. These responses convinced me to start writing a book about my experience. Not a tell-all memoir focused on revenge, but a practical guide for people trying to navigate toxic family relationships and financial abuse. Patricia was helping me review the legal aspects, while Dr. Rodriguez provided psychological insights about healing from family trauma. Standing in my new kitchen on a Sunday morning preparing brunch for Sarah, Rebecca, and the kids, I reflected on how completely my life had transformed. The woman who used to beg for scraps of attention from people who treated her terribly was now surrounded by people who genuinely cared about her well-being. The family that had told me I would always be last, that I would end up alone if I didn't accept their treatment, had been spectacularly wrong. I wasn't alone. I was carefully selective about who earned space in my life. I wasn't last, I was first in my own story, exactly where I belonged. As Emma ran into the kitchen to announce that she had beaten David at chess for the first time, I realized that this was what family should feel like: supportive, encouraging, proud of each other's successes, rather than threatened by them. So tell me, have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and standing up for what's right? How did you handle discovering that people you loved weren't who you thought they were? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and your stories help other people feel less alone in their struggles. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life tales about justice karma and finding the courage to demand better treatment. Share this with someone who needs to hear that choosing yourself over toxic family dynamics isn't selfish. It's survival. Thank you for taking this journey with me. And remember, you deserve relationships built on respect, not fear. Sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the family you're born into, and that's perfectly okay.